It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster as Russia launches an invasion of Ukraine and war comes again to Europe. Joining me today, the Conservative MP and member of the Joint National Security Committee, Alicia Cairns, the Labour peer, David Blunkett, former Conservative Special Advisor Anita Boateng, and the author and journalist Paul Mason. Today, the alarm sounds in the Ukrainian capital as Russian forces enter the country from the north, south and east.
Russia has carried out strikes on our military infrastructure and on our border guards and border detachments. Explosions were heard in many cities of Ukraine.
Whoever tries to interfere with us or threaten our country should know that Russia's response will be immediate.
Residents of Kiev try to flee their city as the world wakes up to war.
Today, in concert with our allies, we will agree a massive package of economic sanctions designed in time to hobble the Russian economy.
Boris Johnson will address Parliament later today, outlining the UK's response. But will it be enough?
If Kiev falls, I think history will ask why the West did not do more.
This is a grave moment for the security of Europe.
You may well have woken up this morning to the news that Russia has launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. In a televised speech shortly before 3 a.m. UK time, Vladimir Putin announced that a military operation was underway as he pledged to demilitarise and denazify Ukraine. You heard there in the headlines his warning that any attempts by the West to resist or interfere would be met with an immediate and instant response. Let's just show you more pictures of those queues of cars you saw there at the start of the programme. There they are, mile after mile of cars trying to evacuate Kiev, the capital city, throughout this morning. We can also show you the scene live as it is now, a very grey Kiev, the Ukrainian capital. It is a different view that we had a few hours ago, where our cameras were actually positioned on a central square in Kiev. They've turned around to show the skyline, the horizon, possibly and perhaps in a rather sinister way ahead of any air assault from Russia on the Ukrainian capital. We will bring you any news of that as we have any reports that are confirmed. The Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, said that Ukraine would fight back. He has declared a period of martial law, military control, and made a direct plea to Russians to protest against the invasion. He's spoken to several Western leaders, including Boris Johnson. The Prime Minister quickly convened an emergency council COBRA meeting this morning, and as you've heard, there will be a statement to Parliament later on. Let's just show you this map, which clearly demonstrates explosions reported near major Ukrainian cities. This is across the country. Russia is reportedly operating a pincer movement coming, as you can see, from Belarus in the north, those breakaway republics that were recognised earlier in the week by Vladimir Putin. They're in the eastern part of Ukraine, and Crimea in the south. Over the last few hours, perhaps unexpectedly, the first casualties have started to be reported. Paul Mason, unbelievably, you were in Kiev just 24 hours ago. You've just arrived back. Thank you very much for being here in the studio with us. What was it like?
Well, it was calm then, and it was so calm that my delegation of trade unionists, two left members of the Welsh Senate, including Adam Price, the Plaid Cymru leader, were able to have a brilliant set of meetings with trade unionists, human rights groups, soldiers from the reserve, ministers from the Foreign Ministry and the Defence Ministry, and military intelligence people. And what I can tell you is that I now fear that almost everybody I spoke to is in risk of losing their life, of being kidnapped, of being assassinated, and certainly have seen their country occupied, obliterated from the list of countries on the United Nations. And
that sounds pretty apocalyptic.
well, look at the. I'm afraid at the moment we don't have Gulf War style pictures, but if you go on social media, there's plenty there. Putin intends to cancel the sovereignty of this country. He's not. I was a critic of the Iraq War. I believe it was in breach of international law. This is a war to end international law. It's a systemic conflict. He's targeting our entire Western democracy, and Ukraine is just the beginning. And so the people I've been in contact with, I'm still in contact with the social movements and trade unionists I spoke to. I mean, overwhelmingly, they're no fans of Zelensky's government, but they said, we will fight. And believe me, they are going to fight Putin's army.
All right, I'm going to come back to the rest of the panel, my guests, in just a moment, because we can go straight to Kiev, to the Ukrainian capital, and talk to our correspondent there, James Waterhouse. What is the mood like now?
Well, it looks the same here, but it feels completely different. There are people in military uniforms walking along the streets, military convoys, Ukrainian forces driving around the cobbled roads. This is a capital city, a country under martial law. A state of emergency was announced yesterday. One of the most striking things was just how normal this city is. And today there have been a series of explosions. They started off over the horizon, out of view. They resembled a thunderclap. Then there was a much louder one mid-morning. Then we had 3 jets conduct a low flypast down the Dnipro River, which cuts right through the middle of the city. And it is a grim realisation of an 8-year war, and in terms of just how steep this escalation is. And what's become apparent is the full-scale nature of this advance. We've had, most recently, reports of explosions to the south in Odessa, reports of heavy fighting in the region surrounding Kharkiv in the northeast of Ukraine, shelling and the breaching of the border in the Luhansk region, as well as an advance from the north now. And we've got, the Interior Ministry says that Antonov Airport, which is just an hour-and-a-half drive from where I am, is under attack by Russian forces. So, as well as that, we've seen reports of fighting as well, troop movements in the southwest of Ukraine. So it's very clear that Ukraine is surrounded and Russian troops are moving in.
James, we heard a little bit of Vladimir Putin at the very beginning of the programme. I'm just going to read to you and for our viewers and guests some of the words which he said, which was, to anyone who would consider interfering from outside, if you do, you will face consequences greater than any you have faced in history. All the relevant decisions have been taken. I hope you hear me. What's been the reaction in Ukraine to those words from Vladimir Putin?
Well, it's caused a dramatic change in tone and language from President Zelensky and his ministers. For weeks and months, they've said, stay calm, don't panic. That plays into Moscow's hands. They've called for sanctions to happen yesterday, last week, to try and put Russia off. President Zelensky has given an address, what looks like on his mobile phone, urging people to go to the hospitals to donate blood. He said anyone that wants a weapon will be issued with one. His defence minister, Alexei Reznikov, claims that his forces have held the front line in the east, and dozens, if not hundreds, of coffins will be sent back to Russia. So we are very much in wartime narratives. The hope of diplomacy is gone. And as you full well know, with all these reports of airstrikes on apparent military bases, there is also the exchange of words. We've had the Kremlin suggesting that Ukrainian troops have laid down their arms. They're not putting up any resistance on the border. There is absolutely no evidence of that. There are reports of heavy fighting happening in multiple locations. In turn, Ukrainian forces claim they've shot down 5 fighter jets as well as a helicopter. We haven't had any evidence of that yet, but the information is coming thick and fast on a day when people are woken up to explosions followed by air raid sirens, followed by police vehicles urging people to get off the pavements and leave and get to safety. You talked about the traffic jams out of Kiev, people panic buying food and clothing, queuing outside cash points. scenes that are going to be echoed across Ukraine as it's very much under attack.
James Waterhouse there in Kiev, thank you very much. Well, that is a very dark picture that has just been painted by James Waterhouse and actually by Paul Mason. I just want to get an instant sort of reaction to the news and what you've heard so far. Alicia, you had already called on the Prime Minister to do much more, much earlier, but that was around economic sanctions. Just give us your reaction to what you've heard.
Look, I think this is all our worst concerns realised, and I think there is no question that only a hard shock with meaningful consequences that hits Putin and it's devastating for those who stand behind him and enable him will have any impact. And our focus has to be on demanding a pullback. It has to be on limiting bloodshed and limiting the worst excesses of what will be Putin's atrocities. And it has to be on providing humanitarian support. And there is much more we can do, but it has to be a comprehensive picture with our allies. And I really hope that's what we'll see announced today at 5 o'clock.
David, your response. We've heard from Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General of that military alliance, saying this is a grave moment for security of Europe and talking about mobilising defences on NATO's eastern flank, other countries bordering Ukraine. But diplomacy has failed.
I think there's been a terrible failure of statescraft over the last months and years, because it's 14 years since the Bucharest Agreement, which gave the Ukraine the impression that they were going to be welcomed into NATO. And 2 years ago, that was reinforced. And here we are today with actually terrific rhetoric and bombast from the West, but feeble action earlier this week, which would probably not have made... if we'd been tougher earlier this week, I think Putin had clearly planned all this months and months ago. I mean, it's unlike Paul, it's a long time since I was in Ukraine. I was in Donetsk, and what struck me at the time, all those years ago, in the Donbass area, that Putin clearly wants to hold on to whatever else happens in this war, because it is now a war, is that the people of that area felt culturally and historically Ukrainian, that the way in which they talked to us and the pride in their history and their culture was displayed to us. And I just think that this will be, I think, like the Finns in 1940, who, against all the odds, took out 100,000 Russians when they were invaded. I hope I'm right in the sense that Ukraine can hold on, because the longer they can, the more this will see Vladimir Putin off. I met him in 2003. This is a different man. I mean, this is
a lot of people have said that he has
completely.
That he has changed. And Anita, your view, your sort of reaction to the situation, because the world has changed actually in the last 24, 36 hours.
Absolutely. And this is not a problem for Ukraine or for Europe. This is a problem for international world order. And we're really seeing a dismantling of the consensus around security and statehood that has been established and hard fought in decades in the past. And I really think that this is a moment for a global reaction, not just a reaction from the UK and the West.
Let's welcome Laura Kunsberg, the BBC's political editor. We're going to just play for our viewers and our guests part of what Boris Johnson has already said today. But first of all, the latest.
Well, there's an extremely sombre tone around the place, as you would imagine. We'll hear in detail from the Prime Minister what the UK and the G7 response is actually going to be to these terrible events overnight, where, in the Prime Minister's words, everybody's worst fears being realised. But he has, in the last few minutes, spoken to the concerns that the government feels this morning in very, very, very strong terms. We have, however, already heard a lot of very strong rhetoric from the government in last week's. As Lord Blunkett said, the early response this week was criticised by many people as just being too timid. But what was also interesting about what Boris Johnson said today is he talked about an economic response, a diplomatic response, a political response. He also hinted at, perhaps in time, a military response. Now, to be clear for viewers, the government is not in any way suggesting this would mean British servicemen and women being on the ground in Ukraine, but it really is hinting, I think, at something that people hope does not come to pass. If President Putin is able to take Ukraine, that Western countries may give military support to an insurgency left in that country. But of course, people hope we won't get to that stage. But there's huge pressure, not just on Boris Johnson, but on all Western leaders today to front up to the reality of war in Europe in the 2020s, with being led by a man who's completely unpredictable, completely volatile, and irrational, who many of their governments actually tried to deal with in a normal way, and who put faith in diplomacy. When we know, can you put faith in diplomacy with someone who you know does not believe in it?
Let's have a listen to what Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister, said a short while ago.
It's because we've been so alarmed in recent months at Russian intimidation that the UK became one of the first countries in Europe to send defensive weaponry to help the Ukrainians. Other allies have now done the same, and we will do what more we can in the days ahead. Today, in concert with our allies, we will agree a massive package of economic sanctions designed in time to hobble the Russian economy. And to that end, we must also collectively cease the dependence on Russian oil and gas that for too long has given Putin his grip on Western politics. Our mission is clear. Diplomatically, politically, economically, and eventually militarily, this hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure. And so I say to the people of Russia, whose president has just authorized a tidal wave of violence against a fellow Slavic people, as the parents of Russian soldiers who will lose their lives, I cannot believe this is being done in your name, or that you really want the pariah status it will bring to the Putin regime. And I say to the Ukrainians in this moment of agony, we are with you. We're praying for you and your families, and we are on your side.
Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister there. We're going to hear from him later on in Parliament when he addresses MPs. This massive package of sanctions, Laura, do we know what it's going to be?
Well, there's a lot of suggestion around, and it will be absolutely critical to look at it in black and white when we hear from the Prime Minister later on today. However, what has been outlined and what is certainly being discussed are potentially moves against not just Russian banks that we've already seen this week, but more Russian defence companies, Russian technology companies, potentially Russian chemical companies, potentially what we heard yesterday at Prime Minister's questions. Boris Johnson suggests that it might be the end of Russian businesses being able to move pounds and dollars through the City of London. Now, don't forget, one of the acutely awkward things about this, actually, for successive UK governments, but particularly for this government, given the links between many wealthy Russians and the Conservative Party, is how money has been swilling through the City of London for years, for a long time. And therefore, if the government really was to say, that's it, no Russian movement of money through London, that would be a very significant thing. But as you know, there's been lots of discussion this week. There's been huge question marks over whether or not Putin is the kind of leader who will pay any attention to sanctions,
or whether he's priced this in,
or whether he's priced this in. And the last thing I would say was interesting. Boris Johnson didn't mention, which if you're watching at home today and thinking, well, this is all far away and it's all remote and it's all something that is awful, but we won't feel it. We will feel this. We will feel this at the price of the petrol pump. We may feel it on the price of a loaf of bread. Yep. Ukraine's a huge food exporter. And, of course, we'll all feel this as well as the backdrop to politics everywhere. Because Anita was suggesting this is a shift. Exactly.
The markets have been hit. We will feel it.
We will.
If we're not already feeling it now.
We will in all sorts of ways.
Laura Kuenssberg, thank you very much. Alicia, you were nodding as Laura was talking about the fact that we will feel the consequences one way or another, way beyond Ukraine's borders. On sanctions, now, sitting here today, do you think the sorts of sanctions that have been outlined there by Laura and the sorts of things that we can probably expect, blocking Russia out of the international bank transfer systems, is that going to make Vladimir Putin stop and pull his troops back?
I believe it will. We need to have a catastrophic impact on his finances. I have been calling for weeks for us to blacklist all Russian banks, to ban the city from being able to service any Russian state-backed company. Essentially, banks die when you freeze their access to money. We need to make sure that Russia cannot transact internationally, so they have no liquidity. We need to force them to use up their foreign currency reserves, and we will see their banks collapse. We need to absolutely be sanctioning the energy, the defence, the mineral, the Gazproms of this world. We need to be sanctioning the individuals. We need to be sanctioning and expelling the oligarchs from the UK. And I genuinely believe that financial strikes will have a meaningful impact because they will impact on all those around them. And we have to remember that Putin's sole priority really is protecting his corruption, protecting his rubles, protecting himself individually. And I genuinely believe that if we pull together a comprehensive enough package, we can force the collapse of the Russian banks, and that will happen.
And just before I come to the others, Lizzie, do you think that is what Boris Johnson is really prepared to do?
I sincerely hope so, because yes, there will be a cost for us, but we are talking about preventing bloodshed, and we are talking about preventing the collapse of the international world order.
All right. Sorry, David, go on. Sanctions on that scale, do you think that will work?
Two quick things.
Yeah.
Firstly, all of this will only have an impact if it's universal across Europe, ourselves, the United States. We'll need, by the way, through diplomacy, to get China involved in some way, but they won't see it necessarily as their interest. What worries me about what Alicia has said is it may well work. It may well work over a long period of time, but they've got 2 years of reserves, of foreign currency reserves.
Yes.
They've got oil, they've got gas, they've got the grain. They've prepared for this for a very long time, and it's going to take something more than the kind of I agree, draconian sanctions that have just been outlined to bring Putin to his senses. So we've got to be clear that in helping the Ukrainians now, we've got to have some practical steps to take.
All right, well,
no good saying we're all with you.
Yes.
What does that mean, for God's sake?
And of course, the rhetoric, as you say, has been extremely strong from the UK government, but perhaps not matched by the action. Do you agree with David Blunkett that actually Vladimir Putin's been preparing for this for such a long time? He's prepared for this.
We think he recorded the war declaration on Tuesday night from the metadata on the video. Look, the aim of the sanctions, let's not mince words. People sort of say, let's only hit the oligarchy. It's not possible. The aim of the sanctions, and I think I want to see the Western governments say this, has to be to topple the Putin regime, not to hobble it, to put Vladimir Putin in The Hague, because he's committed the crime of a war of aggression, which is criminal. And if he's lucky, he'll end up at The Hague. Beyond that, however, there are things we can do, and the politicians I spoke to in Kiev 2 days ago said what they were. One is a no-fly zone. I think that is now out of the question. You could have tried it before. The other is not just money, i.e. aid, carrying on the bilateral supply of arms, but this, Joe, it's give them a credit line, and above all, continue to recognise the Zelensky government and not the puppet government which is about to be installed somewhere on Ukrainian territory. Those politicians stand in danger of being assassinated. This is what we have to stand with them and not with any Putin puppet that is installed in the next 2 days.
Right, Alicia, on that point, just before I come to you, Anita, do you think that sanctions, however severe, however draconian, is not going to be enough to protect, in the way you've just heard, the Zelensky government, people in Kiev, from what Putin intends to do?
So you put in place the sanctions with a requirement to see Putin stop, limit and draw back. And if he doesn't, you further escalate. Sanctions are not the be-all and end-all. We are capable of massive cyber strikes against Russian telecoms and government if we need to. We should be looking at blocking in their navy within the Black Sea Passage. There are many more things we could be doing. But sanctions, I want to see a dramatic first economic strike and to see the impact of it, because Putin doesn't believe that we will act that strongly, and we have to show him that we will.
Right. It's clear, Anita, isn't it, even from fairly broad-brush comments there from Boris Johnson ahead of the detail of the sanctions, that he is to some extent preparing the city and the UK for the harm sanctions could do us here?
Absolutely. It's clear from what Boris Johnson's saying is that everything is on the table. But I think there is a really important context here, which is that the UK cannot act alone to inflict the kind of damage that we would need to give to Russia to make a difference. Because, as Lord Blunkett has just said, I mean, Russia has $600 billion of reserves built up just for this exact scenario. So it's really important that the UK acts decisively and swiftly, but also that it gets countries like Germany on board, that it gets the US on board to ensure that there's a broad brush pincer movement of harsh and devastating economic sanctions inflicted.
Although arguably people will say that London has been at the heart financially of links between the UK and Russia, perhaps more so than any other country. We saw the action from Germany, from the Chancellor Olaf Scholz earlier in the week. That was pretty dramatic, the suspension of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. In a way, shouldn't London be leading the way? Shouldn't the UK be leading the way, as well as hoping, Alicia, that the EU and the US and others come on board, and NATO, of course?
We absolutely should be leading. And when I was in Ukraine, I was in the last Ukrainian-held building on the contact line only 3 weeks ago. I can tell you that everyone I met, from the shopkeeper in Kramatorsk to the taxi driver in Kiev to the military on the front line, was saying that the UK had done more than any other. And we should continue to lead that, because it is unfortunate there are too many rubles in London, and we need to rip those from our system one after another. Now, that doesn't mean going after legitimate Russian individuals or those who have the right to live in the UK legally, but we should be going after those absolutely who are heinous. And I have to say, Germany has done a good job in terms of postponing and delaying Nord Stream 2, but there is still Nord Stream 1. So Germany and our partners have a vital role, because like Lord Blunkett said, we do this together, we sanction together, we act together, we give humanitarian aid together. Only that is how Putin will learn that the divisions and fault lines that he's successfully identified over the last few months, when it comes to it, we will stand together against him.
Jo, could I pick up a point Alicia made just earlier?
Yes.
Which is about cyber. The Russians have used cyber attack, not least in Estonia. We could retaliate, we could do a great deal without boots on the ground, in terms of taking out facilities that Putin needs, including the military attack. And if we could get our act together with the Americans on that, I think we could have a significant impact in the days ahead.
Paul?
I just would caution that first of all, he has said any attempt to interfere will, and he said it, something you've never had, which is basically nuclear war.
Well, absolutely. I mean, that's what people will take.
If we are going to, I think we were at a 1939 moment, and if we are going to mobilise the whole international community and the whole British people in all our cultural and political diversity, we need to win that argument first. The domains of space and cyber in warfare are new, and we don't know whether Putin regards them as red lines. I would like, first of all, to above all, before we go there, to be utterly devastating with the sanctions and make clear that the aim is this is a pariah state and the government will fall. And at that moment, we've already seen both civil society in Russia and key intellectuals and key civic leaders already signed statements to say, stop the war. So I think we could even mobilise the Siloviki, the mafiosi around Putin. That's probably the best way of doing
Paul,
it.
It would take key elements of the military to overturn
and the
Putin.
GRU, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can't persuade them that it's in their interest to do so. And at the moment, I don't think they do.
Do you think it was a missed opportunity, Anita? Alicia, I will come to you just about. Do you think it was a missed opportunity earlier in the week, whether or not it would have changed what has now unfolded? But were they feeble? Those sanctions. When you think about what Boris Johnson and the government has said, how tough they were going to be, and that they would do anything to stop the bloodshed that may be unfolded. And then it was 5 banks and 3 individuals.
But I think the fundamental question is, what Putin wants is to divide Europe. And what has had to take place, which I think is actually essential, is Europe acting in lockstep. And I'm hoping that the consequence of this dramatic and illegal action is that further unification of Europe. So it's really important that the UK is not seen to be acting in isolation, and that the context of oil and gas, for instance, is so central to this, that actually further action is taken around supply. Does that involve China as well, to be able to impact Russia on every single front?
Alicia, I'm going to come to you and just show our viewers the BBC News story. Oil soars past $100 after a barrel after Russia orders troops into Ukraine. Alicia, you were trying to say something a little earlier.
I just want to go back to Lord Blunkett's point, which is there is intelligence available that Putin and his most senior generals are at odds over Ukraine. There is intelligence that's suggesting that Putin thinks that certain things can happen a lot faster than they can, that he thinks his military is more capable than it can. And actually, it's those sort of gaps, those sort of areas that we should be trying to tap into, because ultimately it is only those around Putin who will bring him down. It is only those around him that will be able to stop him being in power and stop what he is doing. And that is why we have to focus on the economic, hurting those around him, hurting him. Then we escalate to cyber, as Lord Blunkett said, and then we go from there, and there are further escalations we could do.
All right, let's talk to someone who knows Russia extremely well, the former diplomat Sir Roderick Lyne, who served as British ambassador to Russia from 2000 to 2004. Welcome to you, Sir Roderick. You may have heard one of our guests here, Paul Mason, saying that this is pretty well the most dangerous moment since the Second World War. Do you agree?
I absolutely agree. We're dealing here with a paranoid, isolated, now rather irrational actor armed with nuclear weapons. And one needs to think extremely carefully how to do that. And I think we need now a Western strategy to apply maximum pressure for as long as it takes to Putin's weakest points. And we need to recognize that this problem is not going to go away until Putin leaves, and that probably is not going to be very soon. But that's what we should be absolutely clear about.
You will have heard earlier in the week comments from the Prime Minister, Sir Roderick, of Vladimir Putin being illogical, irrational, a slightly unguarded comment from the Defence Secretary that Vladimir Putin has gone full Tonto, sort of underlining what you're saying. Is there any rational plan that can actually persuade Vladimir Putin to de-escalate?
The short answer is no, in terms of persuading Putin, and there should be no further negotiation with Putin at this point, any more than there was with Saddam Hussein after he had occupied Kuwait. But what we do need to do is to keep open channels of communication to people around Putin. It's very important that the military hotlines are open at this stage so that there are no misunderstandings between nuclear weapon states. It's very important that we use whatever channels we have to the Russian military leadership. As was just being said, some of them will be deeply unhappy and concerned at what Putin has done, and we've seen some clear evidence of that. One of the pressure points is clearly that there needs to be a massive reinforcement of NATO's eastern flanks in its own right, but also to demonstrate to the Russian military leadership that Putin is achieving exactly the opposite effect of that which they wanted.
Yes, we're going to talk about NATO in just a moment. In fact, Jens Stoltenberg gave his address a little earlier talking about precisely what you have just outlined, Sir Roderick. Can I just get your comment on what people in Russia will have been hearing, or a flavour of what they will be being told? This is from the BBC Monitoring Unit. I'm just going to show you this from Francis Scar. From Rossiya 1, Russia's most popular TV channel. Today, Russia has begun a special military operation aimed at protecting people who, for the last 8 years, have been subjected to abuse and genocide by the regime in Kiev. If that's what people in Russia are being told and fed on a daily basis, Sir Roderick, the idea of Boris Johnson and Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, saying that they hope that there will be protests from Russians, it seems hard to believe.
Well, I think information is going to be a crucial weapon, and the KGB understand that very, very well. Some of the people in Russia are indeed believing the lies they've been told. I've seen emails from educated Russians that have been believing the Kremlin's propaganda. But the Russian people know, and they've known for years and years, that their leaders lie to them. You have to bear in mind that the Russian people now are not at all happy with Mr. Putin. Their living standards have fallen, and outside Moscow there's a lot of poverty. They don't like the corruption. He's been clamping down on their freedoms, and there is an audience there. There was a poll 2 years ago that showed that nearly half of the Russians aged 18 to 24 would leave the country if they wanted. Now, we do still have means of communicating with these people. Navalny's videos were incredibly effective.
Alexei Navalny,
we need to go through social media as well as different segmented messages. The Moscow intelligentsia certainly will be appalled at what's happening, but they don't have the power to get rid of Putin. But over a period of time, we have got to keep getting the truth through to the Russian people. And as I say, these are people who now do not love Mr. Putin in the way that they did 10 or 15 years ago.
All right, so Roderick Lyne, thank you very much for joining us. Let's talk about NATO, the military alliance. Ukraine is not a member of NATO, but of course Vladimir Putin has always feared that that is the direction that will be pursued further by Ukraine. Alicia, in terms of what Jens Stoltenberg has said so far in bolstering defences, he said he'd been called by numerous members of NATO, countries on that eastern flank, on the border with Ukraine and Russia. What can be done at a practical level if it's not going to be boots on the ground in Ukraine?
So I think absolutely, I'm sure the Latvians, the Poles, everyone else, they will be calling for more British troops to be sent there, more NATO troops, and we should be doing that. I mean, for weeks, I've been asking for us to launch an exercise in the Black Sea, a naval exercise. Unfortunately, that didn't go ahead. Turkey, obviously a NATO partner, one of the things we should be doing is making sure they cut off Russian naval access to the Bosphorus. That is something meaningful that can be done. But actually, I think the priority will be shoring up the protection of our NATO allies, but also making sure that we have the humanitarian access from those NATO allies into Ukraine, making sure providing telecoms capabilities, blood, other humanitarian support, whatever is needed. But also from those locations, we can launch, as the former ambassador was saying, information operations into Russia. Information is a weapon system, and we can use it effectively, just as I did when I worked in the Foreign Office a few years ago when Russia launched its actions in Syria. Putin doesn't expect us to play his own game, and we can do it and be effective in how we do that at home.
Right. I mean, in terms of timescale, what are we talking about here, though? Because you painted, Paul, this picture that this could happen so very quickly. I mean, all of these actions that have been outlined by all of you, all of our guests today, sound pretty dramatic, that they would have an impact. But is it going to be fast enough? Well,
look, on Tuesday morning, I sat in the Ministry of Defence in Kiev with senior politicians and intelligence people, and the picture they painted of what will happen is this: a four-pronged attack into Ukraine. We're already seeing it. They said that in 2 months' time, Vladimir Putin could have done that and occupied and conquered Ukraine. With the forces he has now, he can't do it, according to their assessment. What he can do, they said, is force them to the negotiating table, so that the first end game of the first phase of the war will be an attempt to force Zelensky to give up Crimea and Donbass. So I think we have time to do something we have not done throughout this crisis. We need to make Vladimir Putin react to things that we are doing as Western democracies and not react to things that he is doing. So that's why I want us to be overemphasise and say he is a pariah, he is going to The Hague. Russia, leave aside the oligarchy, we should stop civil aviation in and out of Russia.
All right. I mean, let me just show everybody, and David, Anita, if you could comment further on NATO's actions. And by the way, there is a virtual meeting of NATO leaders being called by Jens Stoltenberg. He said that already. It's going to happen tomorrow. David Davis, former cabinet minister, there are no zero-risk options. If we do not act militarily, then NATO will be significantly weakened, and we must fear for the safety of every state that borders Russia. David, do you agree?
Well, the Americans made it clear weeks ago that they've no intention of that kind of military action. And without the Americans, this would not only be futile, but could trigger what Paul Mason was talking about earlier in terms of Putin being completely irrational and what he might do. So I've got two things to say before we finish. One is information is absolutely crucial to the Russian people, but reinforcement to the Ukrainian people. Secondly, information at home. We must be clear and strong, but we mustn't frighten our own people. I've spoken to young people who didn't live through the Cuban Missile Crisis and the standoff of nuclear weapons, and they are worried. I mean, I've heard this already from highly intelligent people, worried about us here at home. We must calm that side of it whilst taking the strong, decisive action and support needed that we've been talking about this morning.
Well, that is very interesting, hearing those views from young people here, as you say, who obviously didn't live through it and perhaps don't know all that much about it, that part of the Cold War. Anita, I'm going to come back to you in just one moment because we have Edward Luce, author of Retreat of Western Liberalism. He joins us from Washington. Edward, welcome to you. We've been discussing about how dangerous this moment is and whether Vladimir Putin can be deterred. Paul Mason, our guest here, is talking about a staged conflict by Vladimir Putin. I mean, earlier in the week, we were discussing taking eastern Ukraine, the two sort of separatist republics. Now it looks far more serious, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. I mean, the fact that this assault is happening on from air, sea and land, and it's not just from Russia, it's from Belarusia, is, I think, a much more dramatic scenario than simply recognizing two breakaway republics and throwing down that gauntlet. We're going to get later today Biden coming out with what is expected to be a much tougher package of sanctions. Whether that's too little or too late, though, I think remains to be seen. Clearly, as your guests have been saying, there is a sense in NATO capitals, including here in Washington, D.C., that Putin has the initiative. The question is, what is it that Biden and his allies can do that will throw Putin off the trail? What will regain the initiative for the West?
Do you have any thoughts on that at this point?
Well, there are a number of really sort of, in economic terms, nuclear steps you can take. You could turn Russia into a barter economy. You could basically throw it off the dollar by expelling it from the SWIFT international
banking transfer. Yes.
And that would basically cripple its banks. It would be forced to sort of go into rubles and renminbi, and these aren't how you trade and do finance globally. So that would be a crippling move. You could, of course, announce a complete ban on on buying any Russian oil or gas exports, which would cut off Russia's main source of export revenue. You could ban flights to Russia. There's all sorts of measures you could take, all of which we have to remember will cause great economic pain in the West. In terms of rocketing oil prices, etc.
Right.
So that's going to be at the back of Biden and other leaders' minds as they wave him up.
Edward, I introduced you as the author of The Retreat of Western Liberalism. Is this a watershed moment?
I think it is. It's a watershed moment for lots of things, not just the future of Western liberal democracy. It's a watershed moment for whatever we have left of the international system. Russia is now chairing the UN Security Council, invading an independent sovereign nation, which 30 years ago voted by more than 90% for its independence, and which in 1994, 28 years ago, Russia gave guarantee to recognize its sovereignty in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. To trash all of that is to lay down the gauntlet to everything we have assumed about how the world should operate. So it's a very perilous watershed moment, very perilous.
Edward Luce, thank you very much. In the final moments of the programme, Alicia, when I look back a few days ago and remind myself of the rhetoric coming out of the government, it seemed like the intelligence has been spot on in terms of them warning of or being bent on a full-scale invasion, but somehow the action didn't match the intelligence that UK and other governments were being given. Would you agree with that?
Look, I was very clear with the Prime Minister that I wanted him to go further and go faster, and I set out very clearly what I felt should have been the vanguard of measures. Obviously, I'm not privy to those discussions, so it's possible they discussed that internationally they would do a range of measures with our allies, and hopefully that would ratchet up, and maybe that was the plan. But yes, quite clearly, I felt we should have done a hard shock straight away to prevent this.
All right, Alicia Cairns, and thank you to all of my guests for joining me on this very sombre and serious day, the day that Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Bye-bye.